The cantina on Kepler Station was dark and filled with smoke. Different alien species sat at tables drinking and talking in low voices. The air smelled of strange alcohol and burned metal. Red lights flickered on the walls, making everything look like it was covered in blood. Commander Zefkri sat alone at a corner table. His forearms rested on the surface while he stared into his drink. The liquid was blue and made small bubbles that popped when they reached the top. His skin was covered in thick plates like armor, and deep scars ran across his face and arms. Each scar told a story of battle. Zefkri was a Vorthak, a species known for their skill in war. He had fought in more battles than most soldiers could count. His compound eyes, which looked like clusters of small black mirrors, had seen things that would make other beings run in fear. But tonight he just wanted to drink and forget. The cantina door opened with a loud hiss. 5 young aliens walked in wearing bright new uniforms. They were Alterians, tall and thin with silver skin that glowed in the red light. Their leader was Subcommander Veltar, who had never seen real combat. His uniform was clean, his boots were shiny, and his face showed the kind of confidence that only came from never being truly afraid. Veltar looked around the cantina with disgust. "What a terrible place," he said to his friends, full of old soldiers and their sad stories. The other young Alterians laughed and followed him to a table near Zefkri. They ordered drinks and began talking loudly about their training. Veltar bragged about how modern warfare was clean and simple. "We have better technology now," he said. "Better weapons, better ships, better tactics. The old ways of fighting are finished." One of his friends, a thin Alterian named Kexto, nodded. "Especially the humans. They are so primitive. They still use chemical weapons and metal bullets. How can they fight against energy weapons and plasma cannons?" Veltar laughed. "Humans are just animals that learn to use tools. They are weak and slow. Their skin is so soft that even a small cut can kill them. I heard that they cry when they get hurt." The group laughed louder. Other aliens in the cantina looked at them with annoyance, but the young soldiers did not care. They were having too much fun making jokes about different species. "I saw a human soldier once," said another Alterian named Pexri. "He was so small compared to us. I could have broken him with one hand. How do they even carry their weapons? They must be so heavy for such weak creatures." Zefkri's hand tightened around his glass. The thick material cracked under the pressure of his grip. He had heard enough foolish talk for one night. Veltar noticed the old soldier sitting nearby. "Look at that old Vorthak," he said, pointing at Zefkri. "I bet he has some good stories about fighting alongside humans. Hey, old-timer, tell us how pathetic the humans were in battle." The cantina grew quiet. Every alien in the room stopped, talking, and looked at Zefkri. They knew who he was. They had heard the stories of his battles, his victories, and his losses. Even the bartender, a large creature with 6 arms, stopped cleaning glasses and watched. Zefkri slowly turned his head toward the young soldiers. His compound eyes reflected the red lights like tiny mirrors. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, like rocks grinding together. "You think humans are weak?" he asked. Veltar smiled. "Of course they are. Everyone knows that. They are the weakest species in the galaxy. They cannot even breathe in most atmospheres without help." Zefkri stood up slowly. He was much taller than the Alterians, and his 4 arms made him look like a giant spider. The scars on his face seemed to move in the flickering light. "Sit down," he said to the young soldiers. "All of you. I want to tell you a story." Veltar looked at his friends. They were not sure if they should stay or leave. The old soldier looked dangerous, but they did not want to seem afraid in front of everyone. "We do not have time for old war stories," Veltar said, but his voice was not as confident as before. Zefkri walked over to their table. With one of his 4 hands, he grabbed a chair and pulled it close. He sat down without asking permission. The young Alterians could smell the scent of old battles on him, a mixture of metal, smoke, and something else they could not identify. "You have time," Zefkri said. It was not a request. The old soldier looked at each of them with his strange eyes. "I fought alongside humans in the Outer Rim conflicts. I saw what they could do when they were pushed to their limits. I saw things that still wake me up at night 20 years later." He paused and took a long drink from his glass. The blue liquid left a stain on his lips that looked like blood in the red light. "The Battle of Crimson Ridge," he began. "Have any of you heard of it?" The young soldiers shook their heads. They had studied modern warfare, not ancient history. "It was a mining colony on Tartarus Prime," Zefkri continued. "The planet was covered in red dust and the mountains looked like they were made of blood. That is why they called it Crimson Ridge." He set down his glass and leaned forward. The Hive Queen's army came without warning. 10,000 warriors, each one the size of a small vehicle. They had claws that could cut through metal and acid that could melt stone. They wanted the mining equipment and the rare metals buried in the planet. Veltar tried to look bored, but he was listening carefully. The other young soldiers were completely silent. "There were only 50 human marines on the planet," Zefkri said. 50 humans against 10,000 hive warriors. Any other species would have run away or surrendered immediately. The odds were impossible. He pointed one of his clawed fingers at Veltar. "What would you have done?" Veltar thought for a moment. "I would have called for backup and retreated to a safe distance. It would be suicide to fight against such numbers." "Smart," Zefkri said. "That is what any intelligent commander would do." But Captain Jake Morrison was not any commander. He was human. The old soldier's voice became quieter, forcing everyone to lean in to hear him. Morrison looked at those 10,000 enemies and made a decision that defied all logic. He decided to fight. Zefkri described how the human captain had positioned his tiny force on the high ground around the mining station. The civilians were trying to evacuate, but their ships needed 6 days to reach the colony. 6 days that Morrison and his Marines would have to hold their position. "The first attack came at dawn," Zefkri continued. "The hive warriors moved like a black wave across the red ground. Their screams could be heard for miles. Morrison and his men waited until the enemies were close enough to see their faces, then opened fire." He paused to drink again. "For 3 hours, 50 humans held back 10,000 monsters. They used every trick they knew. They set traps, they used explosives, they fought with knives when they ran out of bullets. But the numbers were too great." The young Alterians were completely focused on the story now. Even other aliens in the cantina had moved closer to listen. By the end of the first day, Morrison had lost 15 men. By the end of the second day, he had lost 30. Any other species would have given up, but not humans. Zefkri's eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. Morrison and his remaining soldiers fought for 6 days straight. They did not sleep. They did not rest. They ate while they fought and drank while they reloaded their weapons. They knew they were going to die. But they also knew that every hour they held the ridge was another hour for the civilians to escape. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background music had stopped. When the rescue fleet finally arrived, Zefkri said, they found Morrison and 12 of his men still fighting. They were surrounded by thousands of dead hive warriors. The ground was covered with bodies and blood. The smell was so bad that the rescue soldiers had to wear masks. He looked directly at Veltar. Morrison was still alive, but barely. He had 17 wounds, 3 broken bones, and had lost so much blood that he should have died hours earlier. But he was still giving orders to his men, still fighting to protect people he had never met. Zefkri finished his drink and stood up. That is what humans do when they are pushed to their limits. They do not surrender. They do not run away. They fight until they cannot fight anymore, and then they keep fighting. The old soldier looked at each of the young Alterians. You think they are weak because their skin is soft, but I have seen that soft skin absorb damage that would kill any of us. You think they are primitive because they use simple weapons, but I have seen them turn those simple weapons into tools of destruction that would make your modern technology look like children's toys. Veltar's face had gone pale. His silver skin looked almost white in the red light. But surely that was just one battle. One example of luck and desperation. Zefkri smiled, but it was not a happy smile. One example? Young fool, that was just the beginning. Sit back down. I have more stories to tell you. Stories that will help you understand why every veteran in this cantina respects and fears the humans. He sat back down at the table. Let me tell you about a planet called Earth, and a battle that happened long before humans ever reached the stars. Veltar shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The story of Crimson Ridge had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Around the cantina, other aliens were nodding their heads as if they understood something he did not. The old Vorthak warrior sat back down and called for another drink. That battle was fought with advanced weapons, Veltar said, trying to sound confident again. Plasma rifles and energy shields. Of course, humans could fight well with superior technology. Zefkri made a sound that might have been laughter, but it was not a pleasant sound. Superior technology? You still do not understand, do you? The bartender brought another blue drink to their table. Zefkri held the glass with two of his hands while his other two rested on the table. His claws made small scratching sounds against the metal surface. Let me tell you about a time when humans had no plasma rifles, he said. No energy shields, no spaceships, no computers. They fought with simple metal weapons and their bare hands. Pexri, one of the younger Alterians, leaned forward. When was that? Long ago, on their home planet Earth, Zefkri replied. Before they ever left their world. Before they knew other species existed. They fought wars among themselves that make our galactic conflicts look like children playing games. He took a long drink and wiped his mouth with the back of one hand. I studied human military history when I was assigned to work with them. My commanders wanted to understand how humans think in battle. What I learned kept me awake for weeks. The old soldier's compound eyes reflected the red lights as he stared into the distance, remembering. There was a war on Earth called World War II. It lasted 6 years and killed over 50 million humans, 50 million of their own species fighting each other. Veltar tried to look unimpressed. Civil wars happen to all species. We had our own conflicts before we joined the Galactic Council. This was different, Zefkri said firmly. This was not just about territory or resources. Humans were fighting about ideas, about how people should live, and what kind of world they wanted to create. They were willing to die for concepts that existed only in their minds. He pointed one clawed finger at the young soldiers. One battle from that war shows you everything you need to know about human nature. They called it D-Day. The cantina grew quiet again. Even aliens who had been drinking at other tables stopped their conversations to listen. Word was spreading that the old Vorthak was telling war stories, and everyone wanted to hear. The humans were trying to invade a continent, held by their enemies, Zefkri continued. The enemy had years to prepare defenses. They built walls of concrete and steel. They placed thousands of weapons in hidden positions. They covered the beaches with mines and metal spikes designed to destroy landing craft. He paused to let that sink in. Any military strategist would look at those defenses and choose a different target. The cost of a direct assault would be enormous. What did the humans do? Asked Kexto despite himself. They attacked anyway, Zefkri said simply. On the morning of June 6, 1944, they sent 156,000 soldiers across the water in boats. They knew thousands would die in the first few minutes, but they went anyway. The old soldier's voice became quieter, more intense. I want you to imagine what that means. Picture yourself in a small boat, crossing rough water toward a beach covered with enemy weapons. You know that when the boat's door opens, half the soldiers around you will be dead within seconds. You know the water will turn red with blood. You know you will probably never see your family again. Veltar felt a chill run down his spine. The image was terrifying. But they went anyway, Zefkri repeated. Do you know why? None of the young soldiers answered. Because they believed it was right, the old warrior said. They believed that freedom was worth dying for. They believed that stopping evil was more important than their own lives. He began to describe the landing at a beach called Omaha. The first boats reached the shore at dawn. Machine guns opened fire immediately. Soldiers fell into the water before they could even step onto the sand. The water turned red with human blood. Zefkri's four hands moved as he spoke, painting a picture of the terrible scene. Bodies floated in the waves. Wounded soldiers cried for help, but their friends could not reach them without being shot. The beach was covered with dead humans, but more boats kept coming. The young Alterians were completely silent now. Even Veltar had stopped trying to look bored. There was a young human named Danny Sullivan, Zefkri continued. He was only 18 years old. Just a boy, really. He watched his friends die, around him as bullets flew through the air like deadly rain. The old soldier's voice became even quieter. Sullivan was scared. Any intelligent being would be scared. He could have stayed behind cover and let others take the risks. No one would have blamed him. What did he do? Pexri asked in a whisper. He crawled forward, Zefkri said. Through the sand and blood and bodies. Enemy bullets hit the ground around him, but he kept moving. There was a concrete bunker ahead, and machine guns inside were killing his fellow soldiers. The cantina was so quiet that they could hear the hum of the space station's engines far below them. Sullivan reached the bunker and threw a small explosive device inside, Zefkri continued. The explosion stopped the machine guns and saved dozens of human lives. But Sullivan was shot and killed just moments later. He looked at each of the young soldiers. An 18-year-old boy crawled through enemy fire to save people he barely knew. He gave his life so that strangers could live. That is what humans do. Veltar felt sick to his stomach. Why would anyone do such a thing? Because humans do, not think like us, Zefkri replied. We fight for our families, our clans, our species. Humans fight for ideas. They fight for people they have never met. They fight for future generations who are not yet born. The old warrior drank again, then continued his story. By the end of that day, over 2,400 humans had died on the beaches. But they had established a foothold on the continent. Within a year they had won the war. He leaned forward, his compound eyes glowing in the red light. Do you understand what this means? Humans will accept massive casualties to achieve their goals. They will sacrifice themselves for abstract concepts like freedom and justice. They will die for strangers without hesitation. Kexido spoke up nervously. But that was just one battle. Surely not all humans think that way. Zefkri made that unpleasant laughing sound again. One battle? That war lasted 6 years and involved most of their planet. Millions of humans made similar sacrifices. They fought in deserts and jungles and frozen wastelands. They fought in the air and under the water and in burning cities. He stood up and walked to the window that looked out into space. And do you know the most terrifying part? They were fighting each other. Humans against humans. Imagine what they could do if they were united against a common enemy. The young Altarians looked at each other with growing fear. They were beginning to understand why the old veterans in the cantina treated humans with such respect and caution. Even their enemies recognized their courage, Zefkri said, still looking out the window. There are records of enemy soldiers refusing to fight certain human units because they knew those humans would never surrender. They would fight to the last soldier rather than give up. He turned back to face them. You came here tonight thinking, humans were weak because their skin is soft and their bodies are fragile, but strength is not just about physical power. True strength comes from the willingness to sacrifice everything for what you believe is right. Veltar's hands were shaking slightly. Commander, why are you telling us these stories? Zefkri sat, back down at the table. Because next week the Galactic Council will vote on whether to restrict human military activities. They want to limit how many humans can serve in the defense forces. They think humans are too dangerous to be trusted with advanced weapons. He looked directly at Veltar. You and your friends will probably vote in favor of restrictions. You think humans need to be controlled. But I have fought beside them and against them. I know what happens when you make enemies of people who fight for principles instead of profit. The old soldier finished his drink and set the glass down with a loud clink. Let me tell you about the last time I saw humans in battle. It was during the siege of Void Station Omega, and it changed how I think about courage forever. Zefkri stared at his empty glass for a long moment. His 4 hands trembled slightly, and the young Altarians could see that whatever story he was about to tell affected him deeply. The red lights in the cantina seemed to flicker more than usual, casting strange shadows across his scarred face. Void Station Omega, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I still have nightmares about that place. He called for another drink, but when the bartender brought it, Zefkri just held it without drinking. It was 15 years ago. The Krillian Empire was expanding into human space, taking over mining stations and trade routes. The war had been going on for 2 years, and both sides were getting desperate. Veltar and his friends listened carefully. They had heard of the Krillian War, but only as a minor conflict mentioned in their history classes. Void Station Omega was a fuel depot, Zefkri continued. It sat at the edge of human territory, far from any major planets. The station supplied fuel to ships traveling between human colonies. Without it, human trade would be cut in half. The old soldier's compound. Eyes reflected the cantina lights as he remembered, I was there as part of a joint defense force. 50 Vorthak warriors, 30 Alterian soldiers, and 200 humans. We thought it would be an easy assignment. He took a small sip of his drink, then set it down carefully. The Krillians attacked, with everything they had. 5 warships and 3,000 soldiers. They wanted to capture the station intact so they could use it as a base for further attacks. Pexri shifted nervously in his chair. 3,000 against how many defenders? 280 total, Zefkri replied. But that was not the worst part. The station's life support systems were damaged in the first attack. We had maybe 6 hours of air left, and the Krillians knew it. The old warrior's hands clenched into fists. The smart thing to do would have been to evacuate immediately, take whatever ships we could and run, live to fight another day. But the humans would not leave, Kexto guessed. Worse than that, Zefkri said. They made a decision that I still cannot understand. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Rodriguez was in charge of the human forces. She was young, maybe 30 years old, with black hair and dark eyes that seemed to see everything. He paused, lost in memory. Rodriguez called all the senior officers together for a meeting. The station was shaking from enemy weapons fire, and we could hear Krillian boarding pods cutting through the outer hull. We had minutes to decide what to do. The cantina was completely silent now. Even aliens at other tables had stopped drinking to listen. Rodriguez looked at all of us and said something I will never forget, Zefkri continued. She said, "If we abandon this station, the Krillians will use it to attack civilian colonies. Millions of innocent people will die. We cannot let that happen." Veltar frowned. "But if you had no air and were outnumbered 10 to 1, what could you do?" Zefkri's eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. Rodriguez proposed to overload the station's reactor and ram our ship into the largest Krillian vessel. The explosion would destroy the entire enemy fleet, but everyone on our ship would die. The young Alterians looked at each other in shock. Such a plan was beyond their understanding. "I told her it was suicide," Zefkri said. "I explained that we could escape and warn other stations about the Krillian attack. We could save our own lives and still help the war effort." He shook his head slowly. Rodriguez looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. She said, "Commander Zefkri, those civilian colonies have children on them. If we run away now, those children will die. I cannot live with that on my conscience." The old soldier drank from his glass, his hand still shaking. The other human officers agreed immediately. Not one of them argued. Not one of them tried to find another way. They were all willing to die to protect people they had never met. Kexto spoke up quietly. "What did you do?" "I tried to talk them out of it," Zefkri admitted. "I am a warrior, but I'm not stupid. Dying for no reason is wasteful." But Rodriguez made me understand that to humans, dying to protect innocence is never for no reason. He set his glass down and looked at each of the young soldiers. The Krillians breached the station's hull 20 minutes later. We had to fight our way to the ship while carrying the reactor core components needed for the overload. The old warrior's voice became steadier as he continued. "I watched 47 human crew members prepare to die. They were scared, of course, anyone would be scared. But they went about their duties calmly, like they were just doing normal work." He pointed to the window looking out into space. Engineer Pete Collins was only 25 years old. He had joined the human navy to see the galaxy and send money home to his family. His job was to manually hold the reactor controls in place during the overload. Zefkri's compound eyes reflected starlight from the window. Collins knew the radiation would kill him slowly and painfully, but when I asked him why he was doing it, he started singing an old Earth song about going home. He said the song reminded him of his little sister. The cantina was so quiet that they could hear the hum of the air recyclers. Other aliens had moved closer to listen, forming a circle around the table. Communications Officer Amy Chen was even younger, Zefkri continued. She was barely 21, fresh out of the academy. Her job was to keep broadcasting warnings to other human ships until the very end. He paused, his voice catching slightly. Chen's station was hit by debris from the battle. The hull cracked around her and freezing space air started pouring in. She could have abandoned her post and tried to reach safety. But she did not? Veltar asked, though he already knew the answer. She stayed, Zefkri confirmed. Even as ice formed on her uniform and her fingers turned blue from cold, she kept sending warnings. Her last transmission was cut off mid-sentence when the hull section she was in broke away from the ship. The old soldier stood up and walked to the window again. I was in an escape pod watching from a safe distance. Rodriguez had ordered all non-humans to evacuate before the final attack. She said there was no point in everyone dying. He pressed one hand against the transparent metal of the window. I watched their ship, the UES Defiant, turn toward the Krelian dreadnought. The human vessel was tiny compared to the enemy warship, like a small bird flying at a giant predator. Zefkri's voice became very quiet. The ship's engines were damaged, so they could not build up much speed. It took almost 10 minutes for them to reach the Krelian vessel. 10 minutes of flying, straight towards certain death. He turned back to face the young Alterians. Do you know what the humans did during those 10 minutes? None of them answered. They sang, Zefkri said simply. 47 people flying toward their deaths, and they sang songs from their home planet. I could hear them over the radio until the very end. The old warrior sat back down heavily. The explosion destroyed not just the dreadnought but 3 escort cruisers as well. 5,000 Krelian soldiers died because 47 humans decided their own lives were worth less than protecting strangers. Veltar felt sick to his stomach again. How can anyone make such a choice? That is exactly the question that has haunted me for 15 years, Zefkri replied. How can any species be so willing to sacrifice themselves for others? How can they value the lives of strangers more than their own survival? He looked around the cantina at all the aliens listening to his story. Every other intelligent species fights for logical reasons. We fight to protect our families, our territory, our resources. We retreat when the odds are too bad. We surrender when defeat is certain. The old soldier's compound eyes seemed to glow in the red light. But humans fight for ideas that exist only in their minds. They fight for concepts like justice and freedom, and protecting the innocent. These things have no physical form, but humans will die for them without hesitation. He finished his drink in one gulp. After Void Station Omega, I studied human psychology and philosophy. I wanted to understand what makes them different from us. What I learned terrified me more than any weapon. Pexri leaned forward nervously. What did you learn? Humans do not see themselves as separate from other intelligent beings, Zefkri explained. When they look at a stranger in danger, they see themselves. When they hear about innocent people being hurt, they feel the pain, as if it were happening to them. He stood up again, towering over the young soldiers. This makes them unpredictable in battle. You cannot negotiate with them by threatening civilians because they will fight harder to protect those civilians. You cannot break their will by inflicting casualties because they see those casualties as reasons to keep fighting. Veltar's silver skin had gone pale again. Commander, surely not all humans think this way. Zefkri made that unpleasant laughing sound. You still do not understand. Let me tell you about the most disturbing human I ever met. A medic named Kevin Hayes, who taught me that human compassion can be more terrifying than human violence. Zefkri ordered another drink, his 4th of the evening. The young Alterians noticed that his hands were shaking more now, and not from the alcohol. Whatever story he was about to tell seemed to affect him even more than the others. New Babylon, he said, staring into his glass. A city world on the edge of human space. The Krelians had invaded and taken most of the planet. The final battle was in the capital city, where 2 million civilians were trapped. He looked up at the young soldiers. I was wounded during the orbital bombardment. A piece of metal went through my leg and damaged the main artery. I was bleeding badly and could not walk. Veltar listened carefully. The old warrior had never talked about being wounded before. I was trapped in the ruins of a hospital when I met Corpsman Kevin Hayes. Zefkri continued. He was a human medic, part of the ground forces trying to retake the city. He found me while I was trying to stop the bleeding. The old soldier's compound eyes reflected the cantina lights. Hayes was not a big man. He was maybe 28. Years old, thin and pale, with brown hair and gentle hands. He looked more like a teacher than a soldier. Zefkri took a small sip of his drink. The first thing Hayes did was treat my wound. He used his own medical supplies, even though I was not human. He worked quickly and carefully, talking to me in a calm voice while explosions shook the building around us. Kexto frowned. That sounds normal for a medic. They are supposed to help wounded soldiers. Wait, Zefkri said. The story gets more complicated. He set down his glass and leaned forward. While Hayes was treating my wound, we heard children crying. The sound was coming from the basement of the ruined hospital. Hayes immediately wanted to investigate. The old warrior's voice became tense. I told him it was probably a trap. The Krillians were known for using civilian voices to lure soldiers into ambushes, but Hayes would not listen. He said children in danger were more important than his own safety. Zefkri paused, remembering. We went down to the basement together. Hayes helped me walk, even though moving slowly put both of us at greater risk. What we found down there changed everything I thought I knew about warfare. The cantina was completely silent again. Even the bartender had stopped working to listen. There were 37 children in the basement, Zefkri said quietly. Human, children, Alterian children, even some young Krillians. They were all hiding together, too scared to come out. Veltar looked confused. Krillian children? In a human hospital? The children had been separated from their families during the fighting, Zefkri explained. The older human children had found the younger ones and brought them to safety. They did not care what species the children were. They only cared that they were afraid and alone. He shook his head slowly. Hayes immediately began checking each child for injuries. He treated them all equally, using his medical supplies on enemy children just as carefully as he treated human children. The old soldier's voice became strained. I asked him why he was wasting medical supplies on Krillian children. Their own people were trying to kill us. Hayes looked at me like I had said something horrible. Zefkri stood up and walked to the window again. Hayes said something I will never forget. He said, "Commander, these are not enemy soldiers. They are just children who are scared and hurt. If we cannot protect children, then what are we fighting for?" He pressed his forehead against the cool, transparent metal. While Hayes was treating the children, Krillian soldiers found our position. We could hear them moving through the upper floors of the hospital, searching for us. The young Alterians leaned forward anxiously. They were completely absorbed in the story now. The logical thing to do would have been to call for backup, Zefkri continued. A single orbital strike could have eliminated the Krillian soldiers and ended the immediate threat. Standard military procedure. He turned back to face them. But Hayes refused to call for the strike. He said there were too many civilians in the area. The explosion would kill innocent people along with the enemy, soldiers. Veltar felt that familiar sick feeling in his stomach. What did he do instead? He decided to evacuate the children one by one, Zefkri said. 37 children, through a city full of enemy soldiers, while he was being hunted by Krillian death squads. The old warrior sat back down heavily. Hayes spent 3 days crawling through sewage tunnels and collapsed buildings. He moved each child to safety individually, making multiple trips through enemy territory. He picked up his glass but did not drink. I went with him on the first few trips. My leg was still injured, but I could move well enough to provide cover. What I saw during those 3 days haunts me still. Zefkri's voice became very quiet. Krillian snipers were everywhere, shooting at anything that moved. Hayes was hit twice, once in the shoulder and once in the side. But he kept going back for more children. The cantina was so silent that they could hear the distant hum of the space station's engines. On the second night, we found a Krillian child who had been caught in crossfire, Zefkri continued. She was maybe 6 years old with purple skin and large black eyes. She had been shot in the leg and was losing blood fast. He looked directly at Veltar. I told Hayes to leave her. She was an enemy. Her people were trying to kill us. Saving her would slow us down and put the other children at risk. The old soldier's compound eyes seemed to glow with emotion. Hayes looked at me like I was insane. He said, "She is not an enemy. She is just scared." Then he picked up the Krillian child and carried her to safety, just like he had carried the human children. Zefkri drank from his glass, his hands trembling. The child needed a blood transfusion, but we had no compatible blood supplies. Hayes tested his own blood and found it was close enough to work. Pexri gasped. He gave his blood to an enemy child? Half his blood, Zefkri confirmed. He weakened himself severely to save a child whose people were trying to kill him. When I asked him why, he said, "Because if I do not help her, who will?" The old warrior set down his glass with a loud clink. On the third day, Hayes was shot by a Krillian sniper while carrying the last child to safety. The bullet went through his chest and he collapsed in the middle of a bombed street. He paused, struggling with the memory. I thought he was dead, but Hayes got back up, still holding the child. He stumbled forward another 100 meters before collapsing again. This time he made sure the child was safe before he fell. Zephyr's voice became barely a whisper. Hayes died protecting an enemy child. His last words were, "Tell her parents I'm sorry I could not do more." The young Alterians sat in stunned silence. The story was beyond their ability to understand. After Hayes died, I called for the orbital strike, Zephyr continued. The Krillian soldiers were eliminated, and human forces retook that section of the city. But 37 children were alive, because one human medic had decided their lives were worth more than his own. He stood up again, towering over the young soldiers. Do you understand what this means? Hayes was not a warrior. He was a healer. But he was willing to die for children he did not know, including children from a species that was at war with his own. Veltar's voice was shaky when he spoke. Commander, why do you tell us these stories? What do you want us to understand? Zephyr looked around the cantina at all the aliens listening to his words. I want you to understand that human compassion is more dangerous than human weapons. You can defend against plasma rifles and nuclear missiles. But how do you defend against an enemy who sees your children as worth protecting? He sat back down and finished his drink. How do you fight people who will die to save your wounded? How do you defeat soldiers who treat your prisoners better than you treat your own troops? The old warrior looked directly at each of the young Alterians. The Galactic Council thinks humans are dangerous because they are good at killing, but that is not what makes them truly terrifying. What makes them terrifying is that they are good at caring. He called for another drink. And that brings me to the most important question of all. Next week, when you vote on whether to restrict human military activities, ask yourself this. Do you want humans as your enemies or as your allies? Zephyr's compound eyes reflected the red lights of the cantina. Because I promise you, there is no more dangerous enemy in this galaxy than someone who fights not for conquest, but for conscience. The cantina was completely silent. Zephyr sat back in his chair, his forearms resting on the table. His compound eyes looked tired, as if telling these stories had drained something from him. The young Alterians stared at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. Veltar was the first to speak. His voice was quiet and shaky. Commander, I do not understand. If humans are so compassionate, why do you say they are dangerous? Compassion is a good thing, is it not? Zephyr made that unpleasant laughing sound again. You still do not see it, do you? Let me explain it in simple terms. He leaned forward, his scarred face catching the red light. When you fight a normal enemy, you know what they want. They want territory, or resources, or power. You can negotiate with them. You can offer them something they want more than victory. The old soldier picked up his glass and stared into the blue liquid. But humans do not fight for things you can give them. They fight for ideas. How do you negotiate with someone who believes you are evil? How do you bargain with people who think protecting others is more important than their own lives? Kextu shifted nervously in his chair. But surely they can be reasoned with. All intelligent species can be reasoned with. Can they? Zephyr asked. Let me tell you what happened after the stories I just shared. What happened when various species tried to use human compassion against them. He set down his glass and looked around the cantina. Other aliens had moved even closer to listen. Word had spread throughout the station that the old Vorthak was telling important stories about humans. After the Battle of Crimson Ridge, the Hive Queen tried to negotiate with human forces. Zephyr began. She offered to return captured human prisoners if the humans would withdraw from 3 star systems. The young soldiers listened carefully. The human commander, Admiral Kate Walker, refused. Zephyr continued. She said the star systems contained civilian colonies. She would not abandon innocent people to save prisoners who had volunteered to fight. He paused to let that sink in. The Hive Queen was confused. In her culture, warriors expected to die in battle. Trading territory for prisoners was a good deal. But Walker saw it differently. Zephyr's voice became harder. Walker told the Hive Queen that if she harmed any prisoners, human forces would hunt her across the galaxy. If she released the prisoners unharmed, they might consider peaceful coexistence. But they would never abandon civilians to save soldiers. Pexri frowned. What happened? The Hive Queen released the prisoners, Zephyr said simply. She realized that threatening humans with their own people would only make them fight harder. It was the first time in her species' history that they had been forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. The old warrior stood up and walked to the window again. After D-Day, the enemy forces on Earth tried a different approach. They began targeting civilian populations, thinking this would break human morale. He pressed one hand against the transparent metal. It had the opposite effect. Instead of surrendering to protect civilians, humans fought with increased fury. They saw attacks on innocents as proof that their enemy was evil and had to be destroyed completely. Zefkri turned back to face the young soldiers. Do you see the pattern? Every attempt to use human compassion as a weakness only made them more dangerous. Their care for others does not make them soft, it makes them unstoppable. The cantina was so quiet that they could hear the distant sound of ships docking at the station. After Void Station Omega, Krillian Command thought they understood human psychology. Zefkri continued. They began using civilian shields more, often thinking humans would not attack if innocents might be hurt. He shook his head slowly. Instead, human forces developed new tactics. They sent in special teams to evacuate civilians before attacking. They risked their own lives to avoid harming innocents, but they never stopped attacking. The old soldier sat back down heavily. The Krillians found themselves fighting an enemy that would sacrifice 10 soldiers to save one civilian. An enemy that would take massive casualties to avoid collateral damage. It was impossible to predict or counter. Veltar spoke up nervously. But surely there must be some way to defeat them. Zefkri looked at him with something that might have been pity. Young fool, you're still thinking like a normal military strategist. You think every enemy can be defeated with the right tactics? He picked up his glass and drained the rest of his drink. Let me tell you what I learned during my years fighting alongside humans. They do not see war the way we do. The old warrior's compound eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. We see war as a means to an end. We fight to gain something or to prevent something. When the cost becomes too high, we stop fighting. He set down his glass with a loud clink. Humans see war as a test of values. They fight not just to win, but to prove that their way of thinking is correct. Losing means admitting that their beliefs are wrong, and they will never do that. Kexto leaned forward. What does that mean in practical terms? It means humans will never truly surrender. Zefkri replied. You can occupy their planets, destroy their fleets, even kill most of their population, but as long as one human believes in their cause, they will keep fighting. He stood up again, his forearms gesturing as he spoke. During the Krillian War, I saw human resistance fighters who had been fighting for 3 years after their homeworld was conquered. They lived in caves and sewers, with no support from their government. But they never stopped believing they could win. The young Alterians looked at each other with growing alarm. Even worse, Zefkri continued, humans inspire others to fight like them. I have seen Alterian soldiers start acting like humans after serving alongside them. I have seen Vorthak warriors sacrifice themselves for strangers because they learned it from human examples. He walked back to the table and leaned over it, bringing his scarred face close to the young soldiers. Human values are contagious. The more time other species spend with them, the more they start thinking like them. This is why the Galactic Council wants to restrict human military service. Veltar's silver skin had gone completely pale. They are afraid humans will change us? They are afraid humans will make us better, Zefkri said quietly. And they are right to be afraid. The old soldier straightened up and looked around the cantina. Every alien in this room has fought alongside humans at some point. Ask any of them what it was like. Ask them if they came back unchanged. Several aliens nodded their heads. One of them, a large reptilian creature with purple scales, spoke up. Humans taught me that some things are worth dying for. Before I met them, I only fought for money and survival. Another alien, a small furry being with large eyes, added, Human medics saved my life during the border wars. They risked everything to help wounded enemies. I could never understand why until I started doing it myself. Zefkri nodded. This is what the Council fears. Not human weapons or human tactics, but human ideas. The belief that all intelligent life has value. The willingness to sacrifice. For strangers. The refusal to accept injustice. He sat back down and called for another drink. Next week, when you vote on human restrictions, you will be voting on more than military policy. You will be deciding what kind of galaxy we want to live in. The bartender brought Zefkri his drink, but he did not touch it. Instead, he stared at the young Alterians with his compound eyes. If you vote to restrict humanity, you will be telling them that their values are dangerous, he said. You will be saying that caring too much about others is a threat to galactic stability. His voice became very quiet. And if you make that choice, you will face humans as enemies instead of allies. I have fought both alongside them and against them. I can tell you that there is no more terrifying enemy than someone who believes you are evil. Veltar swallowed hard. What do you think we should do? Zefkri finally picked up his drink and took a small sip. I think you should ask yourself a question. When you look at the galaxy around us, do you see a place where the strong prey on the weak? Where might makes right and compassion is foolishness? He set down his glass and stood up. Or do you see a place where all intelligent beings deserve protection? Where the powerful have a duty to defend the powerless? Where doing what is right matters more than doing what is easy? The old warrior walked toward the cantina exit, then paused and looked back. Because that is the choice you are really making. Not whether to restrict human military activities, but whether to embrace human values or reject them. He opened the door and cool air from the station corridors flowed into the smoky cantina. Choose carefully. The future of the galaxy may depend on your decision. As Zefkri disappeared into the corridor, the young Alterians sat in stunned silence. Around them, other aliens began to whisper among themselves. The sound of human patrol ships passing outside the station no longer seemed routine. For the first time, Veltar understood why that sound made some beings feel safe and others feel afraid. He looked at his friends, then activated his communication device. He had a message to send to the Galactic Council, and it was not the message he had planned to send when he entered the cantina that evening.